Evaluating theories of international trade. In case you are tired after studying the six theories, you have to appreciate that we have just gone over 300 years of research, debates, and policy changes around the world in about 12 pages. As a student, that is not a small accomplishment. Table 5.4 enables you to see the forest. As you review these theories, keep the following four points in mind: the classical theories, the main points, the strengths and influences, and the weaknesses and debates. Keep in mind mercantilism, which was theorized by Colbert. The main points were international trade is a zero-sum game, trade deficit is dangerous, government should protect domestic industries and promote exports. Some of the strengths and influences is that the forerunner of modern day protectionism. The weaknesses and debates of this theory include inefficient allocation of resources, and it reduces the wealth of the nation in the long run. Then we have the absolute advantage theory, which was proposed by Smith in 1776. The main points of this theory is nations should specialize in economic activities in which they have an absolute advantage in trade with others. They should specialize in trade, each nation producing more and consuming more, and the wealth of all the trading nations in the world increases equally. In regards to strength and influences, it was the birth of modern economics. It is the forerunner of the free trade movement, defeats mercantilism, at least intellectually. And some of the weaknesses and debates about this theory is that when one nation is absolutely inferior than another, the theory is unable to provide any advice. Also, when there are many nations, it may be difficult to find an absolute advantage. Next comes the comparative advantage theory, which was proposed by Ricardo and later refined by Heckscher and Olin. The main points are that nations should specialize in economic activities in which they have a competitive advantage and trade with others. Even if one nation is absolutely inferior than another, the two nations can still gainfully trade. Some of the factor endowments underpin the comparative advantage. Some of the strengths and influences of this theory include that it is a little bit more realistic guidance to nations and their firms interested in trade but having no absolute advantage. It also serves to explain patterns of trade based on factor endowments. Some of the weaknesses relate to having relatively static, assuming that comparative advantage and factor endowments do not change over time, which we know that's not true. Then we have some modern theories, which is product life cycle, stated by Vernon in 1966. Main points in there is comparative advantages first reside in the lead innovation nation, which he assumes to be the US, which exports to other nations. Production migrates to other advanced nations and then developing nations in different product life cycle stages. Some of the strengths of this theory is that it was the first theory to incorporate dynamic changes in patterns of trade. In other words, explains why things change over time. And it was more realistic with trade in industrial products in the 20th century because the products were now changing and the countries were able to be more competitively advantaged in another area than before. Some of the weaknesses is that the US may not always be the lead innovation nation, and also that many of the new products are now launched simultaneously around the world. So it doesn't really start in one given country, it's just around the world all the time. Next comes the strategic trade, which was proposed by Brander, Spencer, and Krugman. This theory, the main points are strategic intervention by governments may help domestic firms reap first mover advantages in certain industries. First mover firms aided by governments may have better odds of winning internationally. Some of the influences of this theory is that it is more realistic and positively incorporates the roles of governments in trade. It also provides direct policy advice on how governments should function within the trade agreements. Some of the weaknesses is ideological resistance from many free trade scholars and policymakers. In other words, this is by the scholarlies and the people who expound government policy. They openly criticize this theory. And they also claim that this type of theory invites all kinds of industries to claim they are strategic. So it basically, as long as you can make a case, then you have need for the government to help you. Then comes the national competitive advantage of industry, which was proposed by Porter. It's a little bit more recent. And in this one, competitive advantage of different industries in different nations depends on the four interaction aspects of the diamond. Those four aspects are factor endowments, domestic demand, film strategy, structure, and rivalry, and related and supported industries. Some of the influences of this theory is that it is the most recent, is still the most complex, but the most realistic among various other theories. And as a multi level theory, it directly connects research on firms, industries, and nations. So we're able to study patterns of trading and really pinpoint with this theory how the next move can be predicted. Some of the weaknesses of this theory in particular is that it has not been comprehensively tested. The data is too new, and that in an overseas demand may stimulate the competitiveness of certain industries. So it doesn't necessarily relate to just one static industry. First, the classical pro-free trade theories seem common sense today. However, we need to appreciate that they were very revolutionary 200 years ago when the world was dominated by mercantilistic thinking. Second of all, theories simplify to make their point. Classical theories rely on highly simplistic assumptions of a model consisting of only two nations and two goods. Third, the theories also assume perfect resource mobility, the assumption that one resource removed from wheat production can be moved to make aircraft. In reality, farmhands will have a hard time assembling modern aircraft. Finally, classical theories assume no foreign exchange complications and zero transportation cost. So, in the real world of many countries, numerous goods, imperfect resource mobility, fluctuating exchange rates, high transport costs, and product life cycle changes, is free trade still beneficial as Smith and Ricardo suggested? The answer is still yes, as worldwide data support the basic arguments of free traders such as Smith and Ricardo. Instead of relying on simple factor analysis, modern theories rely on more realistic product life cycles, first mover advantages in the diamond to explain and predict patterns of trade. Overall, classical and modern theories have significantly contributed to today's ever deepening trade links. Yet the victory of classic and modern pro free trade theories is not complete. The political realities governing international trade, outlined next, indicate that mercantilism is alive and well. Tariff barriers. A tariff barrier is a means of discouraging imports by placing a tariff or a tax on imported goods. As a major tariff barrier, an import tariff is a tax imposed on a good brought in from another country. Figure 5.7 uses rice tariffs in Japan to show that there are unambiguously net losses, known as deadweight costs. So let's take a look at those tariff rices in Japan. Let's take a look at the first panel. Panel A, no international trade. In the absence of international trade, the domestic price is P1. So here's P1, this horizontal line. Here's the domestic price. And so the farmers produce Q1, determined by the intersection of domestic supply and demand curve. So when the demand and the supply are equally met, we have this standpoint right here. Then we have panel B. Now we have international trade, imports, but we do not have taxes. So in other words, people are able to bring in stuff without taxes. So Japanese rice now is at P1, which is higher than the world price. Everybody else is paying P2 here. So exporters start to bring in rice to Japan, exporting it to Japan. In the absence of tariffs, Japanese farmers reduce their output from Q2 to, so it used to be here to Q1, now they reduce it back to Q2. So what is the outcome of that? We have a bigger expanded triangle right here. And what's happening is right here in this blue line that meeting the end of the rectangle, Japanese consumers enjoy more rice at Q3 at a much lower price, P2. So better price, more rice. Now let's take a look at panel C. In panel C, the government allows trade and imposes an import tariff, effectively raising the price from P2, so here's P2, to P3. So now we have a new price scheme right here, third line in the middle. What happens is Japanese farmers increase production from Q2, so here's Q2, to Q4. So we make it all the way to Q4, second level. And what happens is consumers pay more at P3. So now we have this segment right here with the green line and the small triangle in the section B. The consumers paying more. So because they're paying more, they're consuming less, and so they reduce consumption from Q3, which used to be way over here in the last scenario, to Q5. So now we create a new gap right here. And this gap right here is the imports that fall from quarter 2 or Q2 to Q3 in panel B to panel C. So this gap right here is what happens when we impose taxes. There's a gap in here where there's less consumption, less imports, and increased prices. Classical theories such as Smith and Ricardo would have advised Japan to enjoy the gains from trade in panel B, but political realities land Japan in panel C, which, by limiting trade, introduces total inefficiency represented by the area consisting of A, B, C, and D. However, Japanese rice farmers gain the area of A, and the government pockets tariff revenues in the area of C. Therefore, the net losses equals the total inefficiency minus the net gain, which equals the area, all of the area of A, B, C, and D, minus the area of A and C to equal the area of B and D. The net losses represent unambiguous economic inefficiency to the nation as a whole. Japan is not alone in this regard. A Microsoft Xbox 360 console that retails for $360 in the US cost $1,000 in Brazil after adding import tariffs. In 2009, the US slapped a 35% import tariff on tires made in China. Brazilian Xbox gamers and American tire buyers have to pay more, and some may be unable to afford the products. While not being able to get your arms around an Xbox will have no tangible damage, some economically struggling US drivers who should have replaced their worn-out tires may be forced to delay replacing their tires. According to the U.S. Tire Industry Association, some might be killed should they be involved in accidents before they are able to afford the new, more expensive tires. Given the well-known net losses, why are tariffs imposed? The answer boils down to the political realities. Although everybody in the country suffers because of higher prices, it is extraordinarily costly, if not impossible, to politically organize geographically scattered individuals and firms in order to promote free trade. On the other hand, special interest groups tend to be geographically concentrated and skillfully organized to advance their interest. In Japan, although farmers represent less than 5% of the population, they represent disproportionate votes in the Diet Y. Diet districts were drawn up in the aftermath of World War II when most Japanese lived in rural areas. Such districts were never rezoned, although the majority of the population now lives in cities. Thus, when the powerful farm lobby speaks, the Japanese government listens.